The next speaker actually is someone I've known for a few decades, Khaled Bali. We kind of shared the low desert down south, and uh, west of the river was his jurisdiction, and east of the Colorado River was mine, although I would poach and barred an awful lot. Of course, alfalfa is the biggest straw on the river, and we don't want to have a program like this without finding some strategies for managing alfalfa a little better. So Khaled's going to talk about some of the deficit irrigation strategies he's been working on the past few years. Khaled?
Well, good morning. So we're going to talk about alfalfa. Actually, this is one of my favorite crops because it's easy to work with, and actually it's good for everything from, from dealing with water shortages to groundwater recharge, like what we're dealing with right now in California. So I'll be talking mostly about the San Joaquin Valley and the low desert, Imperial, and Riverside counties. So in California, we have three main sources of water that comes from the snow and the water stored in reservoir and groundwater. Typically in dry years, we rely a lot more on groundwater, and then we've been dealing with, groundwater overdrafted over the last, 50 years or so in California. Now, this year is not a normal year. Could be the, we have so much rainfall, we have so much snow. It's right now a little bit over 200% of normal, and we're dealing with the flooding issues in the Central Valley. When we look at water resources in California, most of the supply comes from the north. Most of the demand is in the Central Valley and Southern California, which is basically the low desert. So expectation, looking at the year 2050, about 25 years from now, we're expected more or less at least 25% reduction in the amount of water that would be available for everybody, including agriculture. So how do we deal with less water coming to agriculture? Down and we had the great speaker this morning talking about the Colorado River, but if you look at the Colorado River, this is just looking at Lake Mead over the last 23 years. Elevation has been going down, and the amount of water in Lake Mead, if you take a look at the last 10 years, or even if you take a look at the last 23 years since 2000, on average we're reducing the storage in Lake Mead by about 800,000 acre-feet a year, okay? And the problem with the Colorado River Basin is very simple. The river is over-allocated, and somehow we need to address that. And most likely, we're talking about California dealing with climate change. In 25 years, we have to deal with the 25% in reduction in available water. Colorado River Basin, we have to deal with 20% now, okay? So we don't have much time left. Alfalfa used to be the #1 crop in California. We used to have over 1 million acres of alfalfa. Right now, over the last 10 years, acreages has been going down, and it's replaced with, orchards, mostly orchards, almond. Almond right now is the #1 crop in California at about 1.6 million acres. Alfalfa has gone a little bit up over the last 2 years. As you know, if you're growing alfalfa, the prices are really good, and actually you make a lot more money growing alfalfa than growing almond right now in California. Okay, so in terms of the major production area, the low desert is actually the biggest. If you look at Imperial Valley and, Palo Verde Valley, we get more than 25% of the alfalfa from this region. A lot of the seed comes from the low desert. In the Central Valley, there are 5 top counties from Merced all the way down to Karen counties. The alfalfa growing season in the San Joaquin Valley is typically from March to November. As you know, down here in the low desert, we grow alfalfa every single day of the year. Okay, so when we're dealing with limited water supplies and we have to cut water use, I think the first thing that comes to mind, there are several ways you can deal with it. One way is to plant less acreage, and that's, if you have 20% reduction in allocation, well, do you want to plant, 20% less? Another thing is, we could do deficit irrigation during the entire growing season. So, for example, if we're growing alfalfa and we want to do deficit irrigation, we could do 20% deficit irrigation the entire year, and that may not be a good thing to do on alfalfa, and I'll show you why. The other option is to do, deficit irrigation during certain time of the year. And for the low desert, July to September would be a good time to do deficit irrigation. So I'll focus here on summer deficit irrigation on alfalfa in the San Joaquin Valley and in the low desert. There are other strategies, for deficit irrigation, especially if you're looking at subsurface drip irrigation on alfalfa. There are lots of strategies to deal with deficit irrigation. So this is just a general graph showing the relationship between ET, Andy talked a lot about ET, and alfalfa yield. Typically, the relationship, it's we use a lot more water in the low desert to get a ton of alfalfa compared to some other locations, including the San Joaquin Valley. And this is just simply because of the weather conditions. When the temperature is high and the ET demands are high, you're not going to expect much yield for an acre foot that you apply. This is just to give you an idea about, the yield distribution for the San Joaquin Valley. Most of the good yield we get before July or August. And then as we get into the summer, we get a little bit of yield compared to the early in the season. When you look at the low desert, and this is an example from Imperial County, which would be very similar to here, we get really good yield, good quality in springtime. And as we go toward the summer, alfalfa yield decreases, ET goes up. So we can look at water use efficiency. If we're applying an acre foot, how many tons of alfalfa do we get? So in the low desert, we could get as high, maybe more than 2 tons to an acre foot. That's in springtime. Summertime, that figure is reduced to almost 50%. So for every acre foot of water we apply, typically we get a ton of alfalfa. So it really makes sense to use deficit irrigation in summertime. That's one thing. Hay quality in summertime in the low desert is typically not that great, so that's another incentive to do deficit irrigation in summertime. So we're looking between July and September. So I'm going to start first showing you deficit irrigation, some of the work that we've been doing in the San Joaquin Valley. And again, just to remind you, the growing season is March to November, and we get anywhere from 7 to 8 cuttings, and sometimes we get yield similar to the low desert, even with the shorter growing season. So what we've done deficit irrigation, and basically, we irrigate normally all the way until we get the August cutting, and after that we turn the water off completely. So we have done this work at the Kearney Ag Center in Fresno County for the last 4 years, and I'm going to share with you some of that data. This is the experimental setup. Basically, we were interested in deficit irrigation and also groundwater recharge. So alfalfa is really good crop for groundwater recharge. We don't use nitrogen, we don't apply nitrogen on alfalfa, so we don't have the issues with contamination of groundwater if we use alfalfa fields for recharge. So this is the experimental setup, basically full irrigation, deficit irrigation treatment, during the summer. And this is just to give you an idea about the yield. We got the yield from each individual cutting and then the total yield. And the bottom line is, for the work that we've done, you could see from this graph, we're looking at percentage of alfalfa that we get from each cutting compared to the entire season. As you can see here, when we get the fifth cutting, which is typically in early August, we get about 85% of the alfalfa yield. So it makes sense to do deficit irrigation after August. And this is just to give you an idea about, summary of the results that we got. So this is alfalfa that was, the first year we did the deficit was in 2019. With deficit irrigation, we only lost about 13% of the alfalfa yield. The next year, 2020, we only lost about 11% of the yield. And the third year, 2021, we lost only about 7% of the alfalfa yield compared to full irrigation treatments. And you talked a lot about ET, all right? And I've done a lot of work with Rick Snyder way back, when we used to have lots of educovariance surface renewal. Rick Snyder is really good with the surface renewal method, which is relatively a simpler version of, like Andy mentioned, educovariance is the gold standard. And, it costs a lot of money to have a station, but you could have another method which is relatively newer than educovariance, surface renewal, and you could have a station for about $5,000–6,000. One of the graduate students of Rick Snyder came up with even a simpler version of the surface renewal called Thule technologies, basically measuring temperature so many times a second and using solar radiation and coming up with actual ET. And this service is only right now available in California for the last 9–10 years, and I'm sure they're going to expand. So we use the Thule system to measure actual evapotranspiration, during these few years. And one thing about deficit irrigation, all right, this is valid for the San Joaquin Valley, valid for the low desert tier. If you turn the water off, like let's say July, okay, and you have deficit irrigation on one side and you have full irrigation on the other side. Okay, the minute you turn the water off, the ET doesn't go down. And actually in Blythe, we measured the ET, and in Imperial Valley, we measured the ET on large commercial fields, ET of fully irrigated alfalfa and ET of deficit irrigated alfalfa. The applied water, we could save 2 acre-feet. The ET, the only difference is about maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches. And so what happens, you have that soil moisture in the profile, and you still have evaporation. The alfalfa is not getting, alfalfa is under stress because, the soil moisture is not there, but you still have ET going on. You have another factor, which is, groundwater. Groundwater contribution, that will keep, the ET going. So, going back to the San Joaquin Valley, we could save up to, 40% of applied water when we do deficit irrigation. Okay, so that 40% is applied water, irrigation water that goes into the field. How much ET saving? Not very much. But, and there's a lot of debate whether we should use applied water as a way to calculate the savings or ET. And this is, something that we have to deal with. And I think, applied water could provide an idea about, how much savings. So we've done lots of deficit irrigation in the low desert, and I'm going to share with you some of my experience on commercial fields that we've done in Holtville and in Palo Verde Valley, because it's gives you much more perspective about what you're going to expect when you do deficit irrigation on a large commercial scale. So what we did deficit irrigation between July and September. Potential savings, up to 2 acre-feet, that is of applied water. There are potential issues, salinity buildup, and definitely yield reduction. You could see the difference between these two fields. That's from Holtville. Sometimes, when you come back after September, you may have to reseed. Sometimes, if you have really good soil and you have relatively good shallow groundwater, alfalfa could survive, and then you can come back, in September, turn the water on, and the alfalfa just goes back to being, full ET, and you don't have any issues with yield. This is some of the surface renewal stations that we had in Holtville. And what we did, we measured, applied water. We had like flumes and measured the flow rate. And we made sure that, we went to the gates and we closed the gates so irrigators don't, make mistakes in turning them on. You could see here the difference between fully irrigated alfalfa in September and the deficit side. Alfalfa was completely, dry. And we have, whenever you're dealing with the heavy soils, you have cracks, and those cracks could go up all the way up to 4 feet. Palo Verde Valley, we looked at 4 commercial fields, and actually the study was funded by MWD because they were interested in seeing, how much water they can conserve and what the implications on, yield and ground quality. So we took 4 large commercial scale alfalfa fields and split them in half. One half would be deficit irrigation and another half would be fully irrigated alfalfa. And we looked at a whole bunch of things, including, soil moisture, salinity, and chloride. This is one of the fields in June, and we had different deficit irrigation treatments. Okay, so we turn the water off after we get the early July cutting. Now there is an idea is, you could apply a little bit because you still have moisture. The minute you turn the water off, you still have moisture in the ground. So you could do 1 irrigation in July, and that's what we call deficit B, where we do just 1 irrigation in July, so you could get a cutting in August. And we did a complete deficit A, where we had no irrigation at all between July and September. This is early on in late July. You could see a little bit of difference between the colors of the fully irrigated alfalfa and the deficit one. Again, this is another picture between the fully irrigated alfalfa and the deficit field where we did complete deficit irrigation, so we didn't have these 2 or 3 cuttings in July. You could see the alfalfa is, you still have a little bit of alfalfa because of the residual soil moisture. And you can get a cutting, but in reality, that cutting could be, instead of being 1.5 tons or, or so, it may be 0.5 ton. Now, what happens, when you go back to full irrigation in October, sometimes you lose the field because of the soil type. If you have lighter soil, alfalfa roots will not stand the deficit and you have to reseed. Sometimes you don't have to reseed. This is a good example from the commercial field. The full irrigation, alfalfa looks great. The deficit irrigation on the other side, alfalfa went back to normal and we didn't have to reseed. This is the site from Holtville. Alfalfa looks great. The deficit irrigation, we turned the water on in October, and in December, no big deal. We also looked at salinity. You have salinity buildup in this root profile during the summertime, but then, the minute you start doing irrigation, you'll have, leaching going on. So just to give you an idea, the bottom line is, all right, so if we do deficit irrigation on a larger scale, July to September, you could save about 23 inches, which is about 2 acre-feet. And in general, you lose about 2 tons. And the value of that water depends on the value of alfalfa. Now, if you're looking at about $450 a ton, $425, $450, 2 acre-feet will worth about $800, $900. All right, water use efficiency, again, as I mentioned earlier, summertime, you apply an acre-foot, you can expect to get about a ton of alfalfa. Springtime, you apply that same acre-foot and you'll expect to get about 2 tons to that acre-foot. Big difference between Imperial Valley and Palo Verde. Imperial Valley, typically they do 2 irrigations per cutting. Palo Verde, they do 3 irrigations. So most of the time, when you have more frequent irrigation, you expect, less stress on the alfalfa and higher yield. And that's what we get with subsurface drip irrigation on alfalfa. A lot of growers went from, flood irrigation to subsurface, and they go from 8-9 tons to the acre all the way to, 13-14 tons to the acre. So most of the information that I presented for the low desert, actually, it's available in this drought tip publication that we have it on the internet. So if you can Google drought strategies for alfalfa, you'll be able to get a link for this publication. Another thing that we do with alfalfa is groundwater recharge, and this year is a great example of we need fields to take that flood water and divert it so we can, bank it in the ground. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but if you're interested, I'll be more than happy to talk to you during the break. To summarize, deficit irrigation could be, summertime deficit irrigation could be strategy to conserve water, and actually in situation like what we're dealing with right now, alfalfa would be a good candidate. You don't want to do deficit irrigation on vegetable crops. You don't want to do deficit irrigation on, the high value crops. So for alfalfa, you have to consider several things. What type of soil you have and the rooting depth. If you're dealing with first-year alfalfa stand compared to a third-year alfalfa stand, I would not do deficit irrigation on a first-year alfalfa stand because the roots are not established. And if you do deficit irrigation on a first-year stand, expect that you're going to need to reseed in October or November. In most cases, especially when you have shallow groundwater and good soil, loamy soil, you could expect that the roots will survive, and when you go back to full irrigation, should not be a big deal. Okay, and just to summarize, in the San Joaquin Valley, we could save up to 1.8 tons, 1.8 acre feet per acre if we do deficit irrigation, and we could lose all the way up to 1.3 tons, but most of the time, if you're dealing with second or third year hay, the losses in stand are not that high. For the low desert, my estimate is, summertime, you're gonna save 2 acre feet, and you're gonna lose about 2 tons. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one comment and one question, and then I'll open it up. You mentioned there's a debate between is your savings a reduction in AT or a reduction in your diversion. I think that's a foolish debate. You should always try to minimize your reduction in ET because ET is tied to carbon assimilation, yet always try to maximize your reduction in your water applied or your diversion. What, you need to add to that, or? I think that's a misguided debate.
Okay, and it depends where you are, all right?
Yeah.
So Palo Verde, so water comes from the river, it's used in the valley, and the excess water, the drainage water, anything, surface runoff goes back to the river. So if you're not saving ET, are you saving water? All right, so, you could save 2 acre feet of applied water, but in reality, you're only saving 2 inches because the difference between fully irrigated and deficit irrigation is just.
But that's an accounting deal in terms of.
It's an accounting, yeah.
You want to minimize your reduction in ET because that's tied to carbon assimilation, but if you can save what you apply, that's the win. That's the extra water in the system.
But keep in mind, ET, evaporation.
Yeah. That's
So if the crop is completely stressed, you're in the desert, you have lots of evaporation that you cannot control. All right, so this is a big debate. And I think the same thing for the Imperial Valley, You have so much drainage water, about maybe 25 to 1/3 goes to the Salton Sea. If you start doing deficit irrigation and you save 2 acre feet, are you actually saving 2 acre feet? I would say you're saving a lot less than 2 acre feet, but in terms of accounting, it's 2 acre feet.
Now, I have one question. The surface renewal or Thule system, what's your flux footprint relative to what we have in eddy covariance?
Yeah, so we've done comparison between eddy covariance and Thule at Davis, and actually Thule was very good, within 5% of eddy covariance. The footprint when you have a shallow, when you have a crop like alfalfa would be, you can go about 40 feet because the Thule system goes about maybe 1.5 feet above the ground. If you have trees, your footprint has to be a lot more bigger. So you could figure like 50%, 50 times the height of the crop. So if we have 3 crops, we're gonna have, you need definitely lots of acres, at least 10, 20 acres, depending on the wind direction and so on. So it depends on the crop.
Okay. The reason I asked that is Andy and I have kind of reached the limit of what we should use eddy covariance systems for in Yuma, because we're down to crops with less than 40 acres, like parsley or cilantro or endive.
Oh,
that may be a 10-acre planting, and
that's plenty. That's actually with the Thule system, we go, 50 feet would be plenty of for alfalfa. So we have plots as small as 25 feet, and the Thule worked fine with them.
Any other questions for Dr. Bali? Okay, well, let's give him a hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Good to be here. Back when Charles contacted me. He said, I want you to talk about cotton, irrigation, yield, and efficiency, those kind of things. I wasn't quite sure how to give the presentation, so I thought about, well, maybe the question was how to reduce irrigation water use and maintain cotton yields here in this climate. So I think this morning I'm just going to touch on some relationships, some concepts that you've probably seen a lot in the past. Want to talk about ET management. Been talking about ET all morning. In relation to irrigation and yield, touch on subsurface drip irrigation, managing irrigation efficiency, accounting for irrigation uniformity in your yield and water productivity, and then a little bit, we've already talked about soil evaporation, the importance of that. So again, ET, Andy gave a great talk a few minutes ago about ET, or crop water use. So it's the quantity of the water used in transpiration, and plus that evaporated, expressed usually as a depth, inches or millimeters. And then we talk about the total ET, or water use, from planting to harvest. So I just happened to pull up some alfalfa data from a long time ago, Stewart and Hagen. These are locations of alfalfa across the country showing their yield and the total ET from a cool place like New York to Davis, California. We did a little work in Phoenix and then in Yuma. So you see, as the ET grows, and Khaled just talked about alfalfa and that ET relationship, but it's linear. And a lot of crops are linear, especially biomass crops, but so you can use that concept in your management, that you have a linear relationship. So it just so happens I went back, since Charles invited me. I said, okay, I'm going to go back to my studies that I've done here at the Maricopa Ag Center. Most of them, they're not all there. There's a couple of bombs. But here's some data from the late 80s to 2018, in which we measured ET using a soil water balance, neutron probes. Measured lint yields and irrigation, a lot of other things, remote sensing. But here's the ET relationship with cotton here over the years. I plotted Erie's number, the classic Erie 60, or from the 82 pub, and that comes in, I just plotted it right on the regression line. That comes in at 1050 millimeters, or about 41 inches. That would be considered full ET. As mentioned, you can get more ET with extra irrigation at the end of the season, and you get more evaporation. It might not necessarily increase yield, but you can raise ET. But sort of the number I'm working with today is that sort of classic Erie number. So the same data set now, this is total water applied. So that includes a pre-plant in most cases, and then rainfall during the season. Same studies. And here, you can go out pretty far, but it's comes up more curvilinear, as you know. So when you put the two curves together, you get the ET as a linear at low inputs. Your total water and ET should be the same, unless you really mess up in irrigation and stress it too bad. So let's say you apply about 800 millimeters, you have that in ET. As you increase your water, you divert away from the ET curve. And some studies have shown that, and I'll show that in a minute, it's pretty curvilinear. It can be if you really over-irrigate. In terms of, I'm going to talk about water productivity. So in this case, I'm just looking at yield per unit of total water applied, not ET, not the crop water use efficiency, but water productivity. And here I plotted it for all these fields, and really, I don't see a big change in water productivity from low input until you get way out on the curve. The classic number is about 0.15 to 0.2 kilogram per cubic meter. And that would be, in this case, the maximum would be at about 1,000 millimeters, even out to 1,200. The 1,200 millimeters of applied water, I believe, is about 4 feet, where 900 would be 3 feet. On the other hand, when we talk about irrigation efficiency of that data set, now that is just simply, I'm using the ratio of the ET, the beneficial water use, I call it, to the total applied. And that's a straight linear decrease from 100% efficiency at low input, or even above, in some cases, if you have soil water that hasn't been accounted for in your total water. But anyway, you can see that it's a decrease. At the 1,200 millimeter, the 4 foot mark, you're at the classic 85% irrigation efficiency that you can grow cotton with. You can grow a full season well-watered cotton at 85% efficiency. But if you have less, you apply 3 feet of water, then your efficiency is just going to go up if you apply it reasonably following ET. I just run through a quick demo slide here from subsurface drip irrigation in 2016. So here's the total water is the dashed line, and the ET curve with time is the solid line. So we start off with a initial pre-plant irrigation, so you're already at total water above zero. But with subsurface drip, your evaporation is quite low. So as you apply water to start the crop up, the ET is very small. But as you increase the irrigation, the ET starts catching up with the total water if you're estimating well. And then you get to the end of the season, you cut water off here. He cut it off around day 130, and then the ET grows, and then he defoliated the crop. So you can see the ET and the total water are close. And then I just plotted the irrigation efficiency part of that to show you in time how that grows from zero. By day 80, that's about, you start a full cover peak brooding, you're at 80% efficiency, and then as time goes on, this ended up at above 90. Then we also included a 70% deficit treatment, which received, well, actually it was, let's say 2/3 the irrigation water of the full treatment, starting on 30 days. And so you can see the lower ET here, it comes in at around 700, 800 millimeters, and total water is just a little bit above, so you end up here with the efficiency of close to 100%. It's about 95. And the two full and deficit together would look like this. 43 inches for full irrigation. That's total water. That includes rain, which wasn't much, and 32 for the deficit. So that's, you know, you expect 1/3 less water. Yields are a quarter lower in this case. Yeah, I was going to, anyway, this is a modeled version of a deficit irrigation for cotton. I just said, well, instead of applying deficit the whole year, like Khaled was mentioning, certain times you should apply deficit, and maybe the other times you need to fully irrigate it. So I picked the most important time would be about peak bloom, when you want to keep the cotton well watered so it can really produce yield. So that would be about day 80, 4th of July. And so in this model, the green, I just simply raise the irrigation to the full level for the month of July, about 3 weeks, and then went back to deficit. So in the end, it increased irrigation 3 inches by doing that. My estimation of yield would be it increased it about 15%. So it's probably a number of scenarios you could run with something like that, but I just wanted to say that there are ways to, you know, with crop modeling, to kind of figure out what a good strategy would be for deficit. So, yeah, where am I? Okay, yeah, uniformity effects on yield. You've probably seen them, you know how it is. Here's some classic data from John Leddy in the 80s, some data out of Davis, I believe. And he really modeled the heck out of this. He shows the uniform irrigation using Christensen's uniformity coefficient, and then some other scenarios of modeling with lower uniformity, down to here, 72. And he's saying that with cotton, this is cotton with water, that you maximize at a certain level, this is in centimeters, and after that you really decrease yield for, you know, various reasons. But in his model, he never achieves the same yield as a uniform condition with no matter how much water you apply. So the point there is uniformity is really important, and the more uniform it is, the better your yield, the better your water productivity. But when you look at some actual data, irrigation uniformity and yield, this happened to be from ARS out in Fresno. I thought it was interesting because not a lot of people have done these kind of studies. So he had 3 levels of uniformity, 4 levels of irrigation, and these are basically replacement of ETs, 0.7, 0.9, 1.1, and 1.3. So you picture that. Here's the yield of cotton versus total water at these different rates, and you really see the curvilinear, the drop. This is done with a linear move sprinkler, so it was pretty precise. This uniform irrigation, didn't say exactly, but I think it's around 95%. But in any event, with the uniform, you'd be at one, you know, your one full ET rate would be optimum. That would be somewhere between 0.9 and 1.1. I don't know why they didn't have a 1, but anyway, that's what it is. But When you go to 80%, now picture the uniformity at 80%. So now your variation of infiltrated water is plus or minus 20%, say. So you apply this water, and now you're getting deficit treatments that are getting higher water. So that kind of brings them up a little bit. That's interesting that with the uniformity in this case, you could actually drop down a little bit on the amount of water and get the highest yield. The 1.1 drops, the 1.3 stays about the same. But when they go to 60%, now we're talking a great variation in infiltrated water. Well, there's no difference in yield. Actually, the lower amount probably is the optimum, and especially in terms of water productivity. Well, the claim is with that variability at low water, you're getting enough spots that are getting like maximum water, and then you still have the low ones here, but they're not really hurting you as much as they would, say, at a higher rate. So anyway, just something to think about there when you irrigate is your uniformity. And yeah, I see Charles. I'm going to not go through these slides. It's soil evaporation versus irrigation method. And here's a furrow treatment, a really nice furrow treatment that we had. Had an ET maximum over time of about 1,000, and an estimated soil evaporation of about 150. So we're talking about 15% of the ET is soil evaporation. You can see the irrigations are the big bars, and then some rainfall. For the subsurface drip, we had a lot of pre-plant irrigation and a lot of irrigation. So like daily irrigations and some rainfall. Here, the evaporation estimated is about 50 millimeters or a couple inches. So is that important? Here's several data sets showing furrow evaporation, that's ES, and subsurface drip. So really we're on the order of about 15% is what I estimate here for furrow, and that's pretty good. And then about 5% for subsurface drip. So the difference in evaporation is about 3 or 4 inches. Is that important? Well, you could argue no or yes. Depends on how you feel about soil evaporation. Excess, of course, would be bad, but traditionally, the way we irrigate it probably creates a nice environment for the crop. So if you have some, so that's a question. I don't really know the answer. Oh, estimating crop ET can help in managing efficient irrigation. And we've seen how detailed we can measure ET, we can model it. I think there'll be a talk later on modeling ET so you can know what it is. Andy mentioned the FAO 56 method. I like that. It's weather-based, it's simple. You need the growth curves that he showed a bunch of them. And we have developed those for Arizona, including now Yuma. And then considering yield, what is the effect of irrigation uniformity going to be? And how important is reducing soil evaporation and water allotments if they decrease? Okay.
Okay, some questions for Doug. I have a couple.
I know it.
But then, Last slide where you showed the water and evaporation
Uh-huh.
savings on buried drip versus furrow. Were the yields similar for those two irrigation scenarios, or was one better than the other?
They are very similar. In fact, 2007 had the highest yield in furrow. And 2018 subsurface drip. So the yields were very comparable. Total water's comparable. The interesting thing was that ET is the same in those crops. But there's more transpiration, I calculate, in the subsurface drip because the crop coefficients were quite high for subsurface drip.
But the yields were not statistically significantly different.
Well, I didn't actually run it, but I would say no. So the yields are.
You brought up something that's very important. When you apply that stress, like you said, you certainly don't want to apply that stress to cause bulb abortion. What's your personal opinion as a strategy for termination to save water? If you terminate this date versus that date, you may forego a quarter bale of cotton, but how much water can you save? Do you have an idea of that kind of trade-off?
No, but there's a lot of research I found because I wanted to talk about it, but I don't have that data really to show it. But I came across.
I don't know what that relationship is, but you know, in the context of our water challenges, throwing an acre foot out at the back end to get a quarter bale of cotton, that trade-off may not be there anymore.
Right. That's my feeling. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but I think you're right.
Okay, any other questions for Dr. Hunsaker? Okay, let's give him a hand and let's take
Oh,
the break.
I'll answer it at the break, yeah.
Now, my question was, if you'd like to do deficit irrigation for cotton, when do you recommend you should start it? Like 3 weeks after planting? Or?
The deficit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the problem's been with, furrow is coming in and applying a whole lot of water, to get it across the field. But I think just from the data I see that that's the time you can apply stress and not hurt yield.
When's the time?
The early development.
But it depends how you irrigate. A lot of times
Yeah.
we're planting into the mulch.
Right.
We're not irrigating for 6 weeks anyway.
Right. So then when you do irrigate, you want to put on a light amount, matching tea.
Thanks, Gus.
Okay.